The city had long forgotten how to be gentle. In the shadows of commerce and control, mercy was a luxury only the dead could afford. But on an ordinary Tuesday morning, in a stairwell that smelled of cleaning fluid and desperation, everything changed because of a man no one expected to have a heart. This is the story of Marco De Luca, a man who had spent 30 years building an empire on fear, silence, and the absolute certainty that weakness was death. His name alone made accountants nervous and rivals disappear. He moved through the city like a storm that everyone learned to predict, but could never escape. Men crossed the street when they saw him coming. Women held their children closer. Even the rain seemed to fall harder around him, as if the sky itself was afraid. But mercy moves faster than fear, and it arrives always through the smallest hands. On that morning, a pregnant waitress named Eleanor fell down the stairs of the building where Marco kept his office. What happened next? The choice he made, the man he became, the price of his transformation, is a story about how one moment of compassion can unravel a lifetime of cruelty and rebuild a soul everyone thought was gone forever. This is not a story about the Mafia. This is a story about redemption, guilt, and the terrible courage it takes to stop running from your own humanity. Chapter 1. The Fall. That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. What started as another day in the city became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, we show that even behind power and fear, there are still human hearts. The sound came first, a wet, heavy crack, the kind of sound that lives in your bones forever. The sound of something precious breaking against something unforgiving, then the sliding, scraping noise of a body tumbling down concrete steps, each impact accompanied by a small gasp of air knocked from lungs, the desperate scramble of fingers trying to find purchase on nothing, nails scraping against rough concrete, and finally silence. That terrible, perfect silence that means something irreversible has happened. Marco De Luca was signing documents in his third-floor office when he heard it. His hands didn't stop. They never did. In his world, sounds meant nothing. Only the absence of sounds meant something. Silence was information. Silence was control. Silence was the space where decisions were made and lives ended without ceremony. The office itself was sparse, deliberately so. A mahogany desk, expensive but austere, windows overlooking the city, rain-slicked streets visible through glass that was always kept impeccably clean. No photographs, no personal items, nothing that could be used as leverage or that suggested Marco De Luca was anything other than a function, a mechanism, a voice that gave orders and disappeared into shadow. He was 58 years old, his hair was grey at the temples, his hands showed the first signs of age, liver spots appearing like a map of territories conquered and lost. He had been awake since 4 in the morning, as always. Sleep was a luxury for men who didn't understand that the night was when enemies moved. The documents in front of him were invoices for a shipping company that didn't exist. Money laundered through 3 different shell corporations, eventually settling in accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. $100 million moving through invisible channels. It was beautiful in its way, the precision of it, the certainty that every transaction was accounted for. Every calculation exact. His secretary didn't knock. She simply stood in the doorway, pale, trembling. Her name was Angela. She had worked for him for 5 years. He knew nothing about her except that she was efficient and that she understood the necessity of silence. "Someone fell," she whispered, "in the stairwell. I heard them falling." Marco set down his pen with precision. The pen was a Mont Blanc, black, expensive. He had used the same pen for 20 years. There was something about the weight of it, the way it felt in his hand, that made him feel like he was touching something real in a world that had become increasingly abstract. He didn't rush. Rushing was for men who cared about consequences. He walked to the window instead, looking out at the rain-slicked streets, the neon signs reflecting off wet asphalt like wounded eyes. A restaurant across the way, a laundromat, a small grocery store. The ordinary machinery of the city, indifferent to violence, to suffering, to the small catastrophes that happened behind closed doors and in stairwells. The city was indifferent to suffering. The city swallowed everything and asked no questions. "Call someone," he said without turning around. His voice was quiet. That was how he spoke. Never loud, never passionate. The most dangerous thing in the world was a man who could order death with the same tone he used to request coffee. But when he heard the second voice, the voice of his bodyguard, Tommy, a man he'd known for 23 years, calling down the stairwell with something close to alarm in his tone, Marco found himself moving toward the door. It was unusual enough to register. Tommy didn't have alarm in his voice. Tommy had been trained, over decades, to maintain absolute composure. What he saw at the base of the stairs was a woman he recognized. Not well, not by intention, but recognized nonetheless. Elena Moretti, the waitress from the coffee shop downstairs, the one who worked the morning shift, who always brought his espresso to precisely the right temperature without being asked, who never spoke unless spoken to, whose hands were always steady despite the tremor everyone could see in her shoulders when she thought no one was watching. She was collapsed at the base of the stairs, her belly enormous beneath her waitress uniform, the pale blue fabric stained with coffee, and now with blood. Her hand was curved protectively over the curve of her pregnancy, as if even in unconsciousness, her body knew what mattered most. Blood pooled slowly from a gash on her forehead, running in thin rivulets down her cheekbone. Her eyes were open, locked on his, and in that moment something in Marco's chest cracked, a small, almost imperceptible fracture that would grow into something he could not control. He had felt this once before, 30 years ago. The moment he got the call about the car, the moment he understood that everything was over. Elena's lips moved, forming a word he couldn't hear. "Get a doctor," he heard himself say. His voice was different now. The control was still there, but underneath it was something else, something raw, something that had been buried so deep he'd convinced himself it no longer existed. "Not the hospital. Get Dr. Rossi. Now." Tommy stared at him. The rain continued to fall, a steady percussion against the windows, against the metal railings, against the world. Marco never said things twice. Marco's authority was built on the assumption that his first word was law. Repetition was weakness. Repetition suggested doubt. "Now," Marco said again, and somewhere in that word was the beginning of his unraveling. Chapter 2. The girl in the chair, Dr. Rossi, arrived within 20 minutes, moving through the rain with the efficiency of a man who had treated injuries that could never be reported. He was 73 years old, Italian, with the careful hands of a surgeon and the knowing eyes of someone who had spent 50 years understanding that some wounds came with conditions of silence. His medical license had been revoked 15 years ago, but his skills hadn't diminished. He worked for men like Marco now, and he asked no questions. He brought his own equipment in a black leather bag, worn smooth by decades of use. No hospital, no records, no trail. The examination happened in Marco's private office on the 3rd floor. Elena was carried upstairs by Tommy, her body limp, her breathing shallow but steady. She was placed on the leather sofa that had cost $12,000. That had been chosen because it was elegant but impersonal, because it said nothing about the man who sat on it. Dr. Rossi worked methodically, his movements practiced and efficient. He cleaned the wound on her forehead with antiseptic solution. He checked her pupils with a penlight. He felt carefully along her ribs, his ancient fingers reading the body like Braille, understanding the language of injury and trauma. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness. Occasionally her lips moved. Occasionally her hand went to her belly. Marco watched from the window. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching this woman, watching this doctor, watching the rain continue its endless percussion against the glass. When Dr. Rossi finally spoke, his voice was measured, professional, but underneath it was something else, a kind of sadness that comes from understanding too much. 3 ribs are bruised, not broken, Rossi said, wrapping her ribs with practiced efficiency. His hands moving with the certainty of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Concussion, likely mild, but the baby is fine. I can hear the heartbeat, strong, beautiful. He paused, and in that pause was all the knowledge he possessed about what had happened. But this wasn't an accident, Dr. Rossi continued quietly. I can tell by the angles. She didn't fall, she was thrown. Someone pushed her deliberately. Marco felt something shift in him, a tectonic movement of ancient plates. In 30 years, he had trained himself not to feel. Feeling was a luxury, feeling was distraction, feeling was weakness that could be exploited by enemies, but this feeling couldn't be trained away. When did she become pregnant? Marco asked. She's approximately 6 months along. I'd estimate the baby is due in about 3 months. 6 months. The waitress had been working for him for 9 months. He'd seen her gradually gaining weight, adapting her movements, her hand frequently going to her back. He'd noticed in the way he noticed everything, but he'd filed it away as irrelevant information. Elena's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she was lucid, present, aware of her surroundings and the danger they implied. Why would someone... Her voice was small, fragile as paper, as if it might tear if she spoke too loudly. I don't understand. I didn't do anything. I just work. I just bring coffee. And that's when Marco understood. She wasn't asking why someone had hurt her. She was asking why the universe had decided in that moment that she was disposable enough to hurt. That was the real question. That was the question that had lived in his own chest for 30 years, the moment his daughter's car exploded, the moment he understood that love was a liability, that caring about anyone made you vulnerable, that the only way to survive in this world was to become someone who couldn't be hurt, because there was nothing left inside him to hurt. You can't go home tonight, Marco heard himself say. The words came from somewhere he thought had been sealed shut. You'll stay here, in one of the rooms upstairs. I have a daughter, Elena said. Her voice cracked on the word. She's at my mother's. I need to. Your mother can wait one night. The baby needs rest. You need rest. What he didn't say was this. Someone in his organization had pushed her. Someone had decided that the waitress was in the way, or had seen something, or had simply been careless enough to be standing in that stairwell at the exact wrong moment. Someone had done it thinking Marco wouldn't care, thinking that a pregnant waitress was beneath his notice, beneath his rage, beneath the reach of his power. That person had been catastrophically wrong. Dr. Rossi finished wrapping her ribs and administered a sedative. Elena's eyes closed, her breathing became deep and regular, the pain receded from her face. After the doctor left, Marco sat in the darkness of his study, a glass of expensive whiskey untouched on the desk in front of him. He didn't drink, drinking clouded judgment, but tonight he held the glass anyway, drawing comfort from its weight, from the amber liquid catching the light from the city below. In 30 years, Marco De Luca had built an empire on the certainty that he had no soft places, no vulnerabilities, no one person who mattered more than the organization. He had built this certainty on the grave of his daughter, brick by brick, decision by decision, until he was a man made entirely of walls. But as he sat in the darkness, knowing that a pregnant woman was sleeping in one of his guest rooms, that her daughter was somewhere else in the city, unaware that her mother had nearly died, Marco realized the terrible truth. Everyone has a breaking point, and his had just walked down the stairs. Chapter 3. Visitors in the night. Elena slept deeply, the sedative carrying her into a place beyond pain, beyond fear, beyond the calculations of survival that had occupied her thoughts for the past 6 hours. The guest room was elegant, impersonal, expensive linens, a window overlooking the city. Everything designed for comfort, but arranged in a way that suggested no one had ever actually lived here. The room was beautiful, the way a hotel is beautiful, temporary, borrowed, existing for function rather than feeling. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like fingertips demanding entry. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, creating that peculiar noir aesthetic that only exists in cities at night, when the ordinary becomes cinematic, when every streetlight becomes a stage light, and every shadow becomes a character in a story being told to no one in particular. Marco sat in his study with Tommy and Vincent, his second in command, a man whose loyalty had been forged in violence and blood, and 100 transactions that could never be undone. Vincent was 45 years old, with the lean, careful body of someone who had learned to never waste movement. He had been with Marco for 17 years, since he was 28, since before he fully understood the cost of the choices he was making. The study was silent except for the sound of rain and the occasional sound of the city, a distant siren, the rumble of a truck on wet streets, the sound of the world continuing its indifferent rotation. "Who did it?" Marco asked. His voice was flat. That was dangerous. Everyone in the room knew it. When Marco's voice was flat, it meant someone was about to disappear. Flat voice meant the machinery of violence was already in motion, that death was already being processed, that the victim simply hadn't yet received the notification. Vincent hesitated. That was also dangerous. Hesitation was a confession dressed up in silence. "It was Carlo," Vincent said finally. He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable in a way that suggested he knew what was coming, but was obligated by duty to deliver this information. He thought she was working with the police. He said she made a call. Did she? "No, we checked. She has nothing. No connections. No phone calls to police departments." Carlo was being cautious. He said he saw her talking to a man in a suit outside the coffee shop. He thought it looked suspicious. Marco leaned back in his chair. The leather was old, expensive, worn smooth by the weight of 1,000 decisions. His hands had sat on the armrests of this chair through 30 years of ordering people to disappear, through 3 decades of calculated cruelty and absolute control. The leather had absorbed the sweat of his palms, the tension of his muscles, the weight of his choices. "A man in a suit," Marco repeated quietly. The phrase hung in the air like a question. "In this city, how many men wear suits?" "That's what I said to Carlo," Vincent acknowledged. But he was convinced. He said she was being watched. He said it was better to be safe. Better to be safe. Better to push a pregnant woman down the stairs rather than risk the possibility that she might be an informant. Better to destroy a life to preserve the organization. Better to choose violence over doubt, cruelty over uncertainty. This was the logic that Marco had built his empire on. This was the philosophy that had kept him alive for 3 decades. This was the price of power. The necessity of brutality, the requirement of absolute decisiveness, the understanding that mercy was a luxury that would eventually be exploited by someone. But watching this logic play out in real time, in the body of Elena lying upstairs, in the blood that had pooled at the base of the stairs, Marco felt something that terrified him far more than any rival ever could. He felt the machinery beginning to grind, the machinery of his own violence, the machinery that he had built and that now had its own momentum, its own logic, its own hunger. "Where's Carlo?" Marco asked. "He's at his apartment. He's expecting—" "I don't care what he's expecting." Tommy stood up and left without another word. This was part of the dance. This was the choreography of violence that they had all learned. Tommy would go to Carlo's apartment. Tommy would explain the situation with absolute clarity. Tommy would leave behind a message that would be understood by everyone in the organization. The cost of disobeying Marco, the price of making decisions that hurt people under his protection, the absolute certainty of consequence. Vincent stayed, waiting for Marco to speak. The silence stretched between them like a rope being pulled taut. "The organization is changing," Marco said quietly. "From this moment forward, there will be consequences for harming civilians. I don't care what the reason is. I don't care what the justification is. This is a new rule, and it will be enforced absolutely." "Marco, if you enforce this rule, it sends a message. You can't protect every civilian in this city. People need to know there are limits, boundaries. You can't—" "I can," Marco interrupted, "and I will." An hour later, Tommy returned. Carlo, it turned out, had suffered a sudden and complete loss of consciousness in the parking garage below his apartment. He had fallen or been pushed. The details were unclear. He had struck his head on the concrete floor. He was at a hospital now, sedated, barely alive, his brain swelling inside his skull. The doctors uncertain if he would ever wake up. If he did, he would never be the same. A message, a statement, a line drawn in the sand. But Marco felt nothing, not satisfaction. Not the old familiar rush of control and dominance, the feeling of power flowing through his veins like adrenaline. Instead, he felt something that terrified him far more than any rival ever could. He felt regret for the 30 years he'd spent becoming a man who was capable of ordering such things without a tremor in his voice. He felt the weight of all those decisions, all those people, all those small moments of cruelty that he had convinced himself were necessary, were justified, were the price of survival. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of redemption and courage can travel. Chapter 4. The morning after Elena woke to sunshine streaming through windows she didn't recognize. For a moment, she didn't remember. For a moment, she was simply a woman who had slept, who had rested, who had been safe. Her body ached, a deep, bone-level ache that suggested she had been hit by something massive and unforgiving. Her ribs were wrapped tight, restricting her breathing. Her head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. Then everything crashed back, the stairwell, the moment of falling. The terrible awareness that something had happened to her baby, that her body had failed to protect it, that the weight of her pregnancy, something she had carried with such care, such love, such anticipation, had become a liability. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain shot through her ribs, stealing her breath. She lay back down, her hand going to her belly, searching for the familiar flutter of movement. There, a slight movement, subtle, but there. She began to cry, not dramatically but silently, tears running down her face as she lay in a bed in a room she didn't recognize, in an apartment that belonged to a man she had only ever seen from a distance. She found Marco in his study about an hour later after she'd showered, carefully, painfully, and dressed in clean clothes that had been left for her, apparently by someone named Angela. The apartment was enormous, the kind of space that suggested money and taste, and an absolute commitment to impersonality. There was nothing here that suggested Marco De Luca was anything other than a function, a mechanism, a voice that gave orders. Marco was standing by the window, looking at the morning city with an expression of profound distance. He was dressed impeccably, an expensive suit, a dark tie, his grey hair slicked back from his forehead. He looked like a man who had been awake for hours, who had made several important decisions and was now contemplating the cost of those decisions. "Your daughter," he said without turning around. His voice was quiet. "What's her name?" Elena was startled that he knew she had a daughter. She had never mentioned it, or had she? She tried to remember their conversations, which amounted to perhaps 15 brief exchanges over the course of 9 months. "Sophia," she said. "She's 7. And her father?" Elena's silence was answer enough. She had never been married. The father had left before Sophia was born, had decided that the responsibility of a child was incompatible with his lifestyle. Elena had learned not to be bitter about it, had learned instead to focus on what she could control, which was making sure that Sophia had enough to eat, had a safe place to sleep, had the love of a mother who would do anything to keep her safe. "I'm sorry," Marco said, finally turning to look at her. She was struck by his eyes. They were a peculiar shade of grey, like winter sky, and they held a depth of sadness that suggested they had witnessed things that normal eyes should never have to witness. "About what happened. About who did it. I've made sure that choice will never be made again." "What does that mean?" Elena asked. She was frightened, though she wasn't entirely sure of what. She understood in some way that operated below rational thought, that she had been saved by something, and by something else had been transformed into a liability, a responsibility, a person who mattered to the wrong people. "It means you're safe," Marco said. "For how long?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it seemed to shatter something in him. He looked away, back out the window at the city below. The sun was climbing higher, illuminating the city in shades of gold and grey. "As long as I'm alive," he said, and he meant it so completely that he frightened himself. It was a promise he had never made to anyone. It was a commitment that contradicted everything he believed about the nature of the world, about safety, about the possibility of protection in a city built on violence and indifference. Chapter 5. The Confession. 3 days passed slowly, each one feeling like a small eternity. Elena healed with the remarkable resilience of the young and desperate. Her bruises darkened into shades of purple and yellow, creating a map of violence across her ribs and her shoulder. She moved carefully through the apartment, understanding that she was a guest in someone else's world, that she should take up as little space as possible, that her presence here was an anomaly that would eventually need to be resolved. She spent her time mostly in the guest room or in a comfortable sitting room that overlooked the city. She read, she rested. She placed her hands on her belly and felt her baby moving, and each movement was a small reassurance that everything would be all right, that her body had protected what mattered most. Marco found himself checking on her at odd hours. Not because he was monitoring her, or not only because of that, but because he needed to confirm that she was still real, still there, still alive. Sometimes he would simply stand in the doorway of the sitting room, watching her read or sleep, and he would feel something shifting in his chest, some ancient mechanism beginning to move again after 30 years of stillness. On the 4th night, Elena found him in his study. The study was a room of books and leather and the accumulated weight of decisions. The walls were lined with first editions, expensive volumes, books that had never been read but had been purchased because they looked impressive, because they suggested a man of culture and intelligence. Beside the books were artifacts, a bronze sculpture, a framed photograph from a museum, nothing personal, nothing that suggested Marco De Luca was anything other than a collector of expensive things. "Why?" Elena asked, and her voice was small in that room, fragile as glass. "Why are you keeping me here? What do you want from me? Are you going to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She couldn't say the word, but Marco understood. She was asking if he was going to hurt her, If he had kept her here for some purpose that would eventually reveal itself as terrible and violent. Marco looked at her for a long moment. She was standing in the doorway, her hand on the frame for support, and she looked impossibly young, impossibly fragile. She was perhaps 35 years old, but she looked younger, as if the weight of her life had been balanced out by the weight of her love for her daughter, leaving her caught somewhere in between. "I have a daughter," Marco heard himself say. The words came from a place so deep that he wasn't entirely sure they were real. She was 7, like your Sophia. Her name was also Sophia, actually, Sophia Elena. Elena sat down slowly in one of the leather chairs. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. She was in a car with her mother, my ex-wife. Marco was speaking quietly now, recounting something he had told no one except therapists he'd seen in the first few years after Sophia's death. And eventually he'd stopped seeing them because they couldn't offer him what he actually wanted, which was for time to move backward, for choices to unmake themselves, for his daughter to be alive. The car was meant for me. It was a message from a rival, a statement, a way of reminding me that no one was safe, that everyone I loved was a target. He paused, and in that pause was a vast landscape of grief, 30 years of it, compressed into a silence that could barely contain it. "Sophia was in the car for 3 minutes before it exploded," he continued. "The police said she wouldn't have suffered. I don't know if that's true. I've spent 30 years trying not to know. I've spent 30 years trying not to imagine what those 3 minutes were like, what she thought if she was afraid, if she called for me." His hands were trembling. Elena watched this man. This dangerous man, this man who had organized the violence that Carlo had suffered just days ago, and she saw something she hadn't expected to see. She saw a father. She saw a man broken by grief, held together only by rage and control and the absolute commitment to never feel anything again. "After that," Marco continued, "I stopped being a man. I became a function, control, fear, violence. These were the only languages I understood. I built an empire to make sure no one could ever hurt me again. But the only way to do that was to become someone who could hurt anyone. Someone like me." He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the city glittered with the lights of 1,000 lives, each one precious, each one fragile, each one capable of breaking at any moment. The rain had stopped, leaving everything wet and gleaming. "When I saw you at the bottom of those stairs," he said, not turning around, "I saw Sophia. I saw the daughter I couldn't save. I saw what might have happened to her if the blast hadn't been so complete. And for the first time in 30 years, I wanted to save someone. I wanted to do what I couldn't do for Sophia. I wanted to be someone capable of protection rather than destruction." Elena was crying silently. She understood in that moment the full weight of what had happened to her. She wasn't just a victim of violence. She was the catalyst for something much larger, the beginning of a man's attempt to transform himself into something other than what he had become. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Marco said, turning to look at her, "we see if redemption is possible. We see if a man like me can become something other than what he's built himself into. We see if, at this late stage of my life, I still have the capacity for change." Chapter 6. The Choice. Elena left the apartment for the first time in a week. Marco arranged it carefully. A car, a driver, no risks. Security that was present but invisible. She went to collect her daughter from her mother's house in the outer neighborhoods, the kind of area where families like hers lived, where money was scarce but love was abundant, where people worked multiple jobs and prayed that their children would have better lives than their own. Elena's mother, Rosa, was a woman in her 60s with the weariness that comes from a lifetime of small struggles. She had worked as a cleaner in hospitals, had raised 3 children alone after her husband died, had learned that the world offered little mercy and that survival required constant vigilance. When Eleanor arrived, Rosa embraced her daughter carefully, her eyes searching for injury. "What happened?" Rosa asked. "You didn't answer my calls, you didn't—" "I'm fine, Mama, it was an accident at work. I fell, I'm recovering." Elena didn't mention Marco. She didn't mention the apartment. She didn't mention the man who had appeared in her life like a dark angel, carrying with him the weight of his own catastrophe and somehow offering protection through the sheer force of his terrible power. Sophia was in the living room, playing with toys on the floor. She was small for her age, dark-eyed, with her mother's serious expression and a wariness that came from growing up in a world where adults couldn't always be trusted, where money was always tight, where the future was uncertain. She looked up when her mother entered, and for a moment she simply stared. "Mama, Sophia stood up carefully, as if approaching something fragile. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, mija. I'm fine. I just needed to rest." Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are we going back to the bad place?" Elena understood what Sophia meant. The bad place was the apartment where they had lived before, where Eleanor had worked as a night cleaner while Rosa watched Sophia, where money was always tight, where the future was always uncertain. The bad place was what Elena had been willing to endure to keep her daughter safe and fed and loved. "No," Elena said, "we're not going back. We're going somewhere new." When Elena and Sophia returned to Marco's apartment, he was waiting. The girl was small, dark-eyed, with her mother's serious expression and the particular wariness that only children possess, unfiltered by the need to be polite or diplomatic or afraid. She looked at Marco with the clarity that only children can manage, seeing through the expensive suits and the careful words to the broken man underneath. "Are you a bad man?" Sophia asked without hesitation. She was sitting on the sofa, her legs not quite touching the floor, her hands folded in her lap. Marco didn't hesitate. Truthfulness seemed like the only possible response. "Yes," he said, "I am. My mama says you helped her." "I did." "Then you're not so bad," Sophia said with the logic of childhood, and she went into the living room to watch cartoons. The matter settled in her mind. The complexity of the world reduced to a simple equation. If you help people, you're not bad. It was a philosophy that Marco had abandoned 30 years ago, and hearing it articulated so simply by a 7-year-old girl seemed to puncture something inside him. That night, Elena found him again in the study. He was looking at a photograph in a silver frame. It was a young girl, perhaps 6 years old, dark-haired, smiling at the camera with the absolute confidence of a child who has never known loss. "Sophia," Eleanor said softly. "Yes," Marco replied. He didn't put the photograph away. For the first time in 30 years, he allowed himself to look at it while someone else was watching. This was taken a week before the accident. Elena sat down in one of the leather chairs. She understood what the photograph represented. It was a portal to a version of Marco that no longer existed, to a man capable of fatherhood, capable of joy, capable of love, without the weight of 30 years of grief. "I'm leaving the city," Elena said. "Tomorrow. I have money saved. I'm going to take Sophia somewhere quiet, somewhere safe, somewhere we can start again. I wanted to thank you first. I wanted you to know that what you did matters, not just to me, but to her. She'll grow up knowing that there was a man who chose to be good, who chose compassion over cruelty." Marco wanted to ask her to stay. The desire was so strong it nearly broke him. He wanted to say, "Stay here, in this apartment, in this life that I'm trying to build into something other than what it's been. Stay here and help me become someone I can recognize. Stay here so that I don't have to do this alone." But he understood finally what real compassion was. It was the willingness to let someone go, even when you had the power to keep them. It was the knowledge that love sometimes meant releasing the people you loved so that they could have the lives they deserved. "I have something for you," he said, and he handed her an envelope. Inside was a deed to a house, property on the coast several hundred kilometers from the city, paid in full. The house had a garden, a view of the ocean, space for Sophia to grow. And inside the envelope was also a bank account number, enough money to ensure that she and Sophia would never have to work another day they didn't want to, enough to give them security, freedom, the possibility of a life built on choice rather than necessity. "I can't," Elena said immediately. "You can," he replied, "and you will. Because the only redemption I have left is knowing that something good came from all this, that somewhere in this world you and Sophia are safe. That's my redemption. That's how I become someone other than what I've been." If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Marco De Luca reach more people who still believe in compassion. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. After Elena left with Sophia, taking a car Marco had arranged, driving toward the coast and a new life, something shifted in the machinery of Marco's empire. Not visibly at first, the money still flowed. The territory still belonged to him. The organizations that he had built still operated with the precision of a well-maintained engine. But internally, something fundamental was changing. Men who had always obeyed him began to question. In the small moments, the quiet conversations in rooms where they thought Marco couldn't hear them. Why had he punished Carlo so severely for what amounted to a security decision? Why was he suddenly concerned about the well-being of ordinary people? Why did he refuse to engage in certain operations that might hurt civilians? Why was he spending so much time away from the business, delegating more, pulling back from the active management of violence? The organization had developed its own momentum over 30 years. It had its own culture, its own logic, its own understanding of how power was maintained. That logic required violence. That logic required the absolute certainty that anyone could be hurt, anyone could be sacrificed, anyone could be destroyed in the name of security or profit or power. Marco was beginning to contradict that logic. Vincent approached him with a proposal to expand into the Western Docks. The area was currently controlled by a smaller organization, but Marco had the resources and the connections to take it. The problem was that the docks were residential. 300 families lived there in tenements that Marco's organization actually owned. The proposal was to displace them, demolish the buildings, build something more profitable. A warehouse complex perhaps, or luxury apartments for tourists. 300 families, 300 lives, 300 stories that Marco would never know. 300 futures that would be disrupted, 300 versions of Elena and Sophia scattered into the city, searching for stability. "We can do it cleanly," Vincent said, using the word cleanly as if it made the displacement humane, as if the terminology somehow neutralized the violence. "Give them 60 days' notice. Help them relocate to the outer neighborhoods. We'll even offer subsidies for first and last month's rent. It's more than fair. It's more than anyone would expect." "No," Marco said. Vincent blinked. "But the profit margins?" I said no. "Marco, if you move against this expansion, it sends a message. You can't protect every family in this city. People need to know there are limits, boundaries, that you understand the cost of doing business. You can't become sentimental about, 'I'm done,'" Marco said quietly. He was standing by the window of his study, looking out at the city. "I'm done with this. All of it." Vincent stared at him. "What do you mean you're done?" "I mean I'm stepping back, I'm pulling out. I'm going to begin the process of dismantling this organization and transferring operations to people who actually want to run it." "But you built this. You've spent 30 years building this. Yes, Marco said, and I've spent 30 years regretting it. Within a month, he had begun the process. It was complicated. An empire didn't dismantle itself easily. There were negotiations to be done, territories to be transferred, money to be redistributed. The other families in the city thought he was dying, having a mental collapse, losing his mind. No one had ever voluntarily given up power like this. Power was everything. Power was the only thing that made sense. But Marco had learned something that most powerful men never do. Power without purpose is just a weight you carry until it crushes you. He transferred operations to Vincent and to other younger men who had been groomed for leadership. He distributed assets to his lieutenants. He made it clear, through a series of carefully calculated gestures, that he was walking away. The organization would continue. The machinery would keep moving. But he would no longer be the engine driving it. His apartment was sold. His office was closed. He moved to a small place in the outer neighborhoods, far from the city center, far from the neon and the rain and the machinery of power. It was a modest apartment, just 2 rooms, with a view of ordinary streets where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. After 30 years of isolation, of walls carefully constructed, of a life designed to keep everyone at a distance, Marco discovered what he had been missing: the sound of children playing, the smell of someone else's cooking, the ordinary noise of people living. He began to volunteer at a local shelter that served displaced people, families like the ones that would have been displaced from the docks if he hadn't changed his mind. He served food, he listened to stories, he did small acts of kindness that most people would never notice and fewer would ever remember. But he remembered. Every act of kindness was a conversation with a dead daughter. Every gesture of compassion was a way of asking, "Can you forgive me, Sophia? Can you forgive the man I became?" Chapter 8. The Grave. 2 years after Elena left, Marco went to visit his daughter's grave for the first time in a decade. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes from a place where everyone is listening. It was autumn, the trees turning shades of red and gold, the air crisp and clear. Marco had driven here without thinking about it, his body carrying him to this place that his mind had been avoiding for so long. The stone was simple as he had designed it. Sophia Elena De Luca. She was loved more than words could say. He had never known what else to put there. How do you summarize a life that ended before it began? How do you capture the weight of 30 years of grief? How do you express the fact that you would trade every moment of power, every success, every achievement, if it meant that your daughter could wake up and be alive? He sat there for hours as the sun moved across the sky, the light changing from gold to amber to deep red as the afternoon progressed. He was alone. There were other graves nearby, other people grieving their own losses, but they seemed distant, as if Marco was enclosed in a bubble of solitude that no one else could penetrate. He remembered Sophia at 3 years old, laughing at a cartoon, her entire body convulsing with the pure joy of something funny. He remembered Sophia at 5, asking him to fix her bicycle because her mother had given up on the task. He remembered Sophia at 7 for one moment, safe in her mother's car, before everything ended. He remembered every moment of her life, compressed now into these memories, all that remained of a person who had meant everything. "I'm sorry," he said to the stone, to the memory, to the ghost of the man he'd been. His voice was quiet, but in the cemetery quiet it seemed to echo. "I'm sorry I spent so long being angry at the world for what happened to you. I'm sorry I hurt so many people, trying to make sure no one could hurt me again. I'm sorry I became the thing I was afraid of. I'm sorry I wasted 30 years becoming someone you wouldn't have recognized." A light rain began to fall, the kind of gentle rain that feels almost like blessing, that feels like the sky is offering forgiveness, even when the person asking for it isn't sure they deserve it. But I did one good thing, he continued, speaking louder now, his voice carrying into the rain, into the cemetery, into the vast indifference of the universe. There's a woman and her daughter, safe, alive, free. They exist because I finally remembered something that you taught me. Before you died, you taught me that love was possible, that kindness mattered, that being gentle was the bravest choice a man could make. The rain continued to fall. Marco stood up and placed a flower on the stone, a white rose, Sophia's favorite, the flower he had brought to this grave every year for the first 10 years after her death, before he stopped visiting, stopped grieving openly, stopped allowing himself to feel. "I'm trying," he said finally, and he turned away from the grave and walked back toward the car. "I'm becoming someone better. I'm not fast at it, and I'm not always successful, but I'm trying, and I'm doing it for you. I'm doing it so that somewhere, somehow, there's a man who lived differently because he remembered his daughter. There's a man who chose compassion instead of cruelty. There's a man who became better." The sun began to set as he drove back to his small apartment in the outer neighborhoods. The rain stopped, the clouds cleared, and in the fading light, Marco De Luca felt something that he had thought was impossible. He felt a small, fragile sense of peace. Chapter 9. The letter. 1 year later, Marco received a letter. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper, addressed in careful handwriting that he didn't recognize. No return address. Just his name, written in a deliberate, careful script. Inside was a photograph and a single handwritten letter. The photograph was of a woman and a child standing in front of a small cafe by the ocean. The woman was Elena, older somehow than he remembered, marked by time and experience, but with a lightness in her face that hadn't been there before. Beside her was Sophia, now 8 years old, laughing at something beyond the camera's view, her dark eyes bright with joy. The cafe behind them was modest, small, but beautiful, the kind of place where people could gather, where stories could be shared, where community could be built. He opened the letter with trembling hands. "Dear Marco," it began, "I wanted you to know that we arrived safely at the coast. The house you gave us is more than we could have imagined. Sophia has started school. She has friends. She plays on the beach and collects shells and has begun to think about the future as something that might hold possibility rather than just survival. I opened the cafe you see in the photograph 2 months ago. I call it Elena's Place, which is perhaps not very creative, but it is honest. I serve good coffee and listen to people's stories. We've become a gathering place for the small community that lives here. I've discovered something I never expected to discover. I'm a good listener. I'm good at making people feel less alone. I have told Sophia stories about you, but not the whole truth. I've told her that there was a man who helped us when we needed help, who offered us a chance to have a different life. I've told her that sometimes people who have been hardened by the world can find softness again. I've told her that kindness is the rarest thing in the world, and that when you encounter it, you should remember it forever. I wanted you to know that what you did matters, not just in the practical sense, not just the money and the house and the security, but in a deeper way. You showed us that people can change. You showed us that redemption is possible. You showed us that a man can spend 30 years becoming someone hard and difficult, and then, in a moment, choose to become someone different. Every day at the cafe, I serve people who have also been hardened by the world. I see in their faces the same armor that I saw in yours, and I think about you, and I understand that there are many people in this world who need to be reminded that change is possible, that kindness matters, that becoming better is not only possible, but necessary. Sophia found a shell on the beach yesterday that was perfectly intact. She wanted to bring it to school to show her teacher, but then she decided that she wanted to keep it and think about you. Because, she said, the shell was hard on the outside, but beautiful inside. She said that you were like that too. Thank you for everything. Thank you for showing us what real courage looks like. Thank you for choosing compassion. And thank you for being the man that Sophia needed to see, even if you didn't know it at the time. With deep gratitude and respect, Elena Moretti. Marco sat with this letter for a long time, reading it over and over again. He held the photograph and looked at Elena and Sophia, really looked at them, and he saw in their faces the evidence of his redemption. He saw the proof that change was possible, that one moment of compassion could ripple outward and transform lives, that even a man like him could become something other than what he had been. He placed the photograph on his desk, where he could see it every day. He had closed his office. He had closed his apartment in the city. He had moved to a small place in the outer neighborhoods, to a life built on silence and solitude, and the careful practice of becoming a better person. He volunteered at a local shelter now, serving food, listening to stories, doing small acts of kindness that most people would never notice and fewer would ever remember. But he remembered. Every morning he woke and chose to be the kind of man he had always told himself he could never be. Every day was a small rebellion against 30 years of cruelty. Every act of kindness was a conversation with a dead daughter, a way of saying, "I'm sorry, I'm trying, I'm becoming someone you would have been proud of." The city moved around him, indifferent as always. The rain fell, the neon signs flickered. The world continued its ancient dance of suffering and survival. But in one small apartment, in one man's carefully rebuilt heart, there was something that had never been there before. The knowledge that redemption was possible, that mercy was stronger than fear, that even a man who had spent his life dealing in darkness could choose at any moment to step into the light. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, forgiveness, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of Marco De Luca. See you in the next one. Epilogue. The Inheritance. Years later, long after Marco had passed away, quietly, peacefully in his sleep, in the small apartment in the outer neighborhoods, Elena's daughter Sophia, now grown, now 23 years old, a university student studying social work and community development, discovered Marco's foundation. She learned that this man, this stranger her mother had never fully explained, had spent his final years building places of refuge for people like her mother had once been. She learned that he had quietly transferred nearly all of his remaining wealth to organizations that served displaced families, that offered job training, that built communities in the spaces left behind by violence and exploitation. She learned that in the 6 years between when Eleanor left and when Marco died, he had worked at the shelter almost every day. He had cooked meals. He had listened to stories. He had helped people rebuild their lives. He had, in the quiet, ordinary way that people rarely notice, become something close to a saint. Sophia visited his grave on a quiet afternoon. The cemetery was peaceful. The trees older now than they had been 6 years ago, the world continuing its rotation. She placed a photograph on his grave. A picture of the cafe her mother still ran, filled with light and life, and the kind of ordinary beauty that only means something if you've known its opposite. She placed a shell beside it, the same shell she had collected that day on the beach, the one she had kept all these years thinking of Marco. And she understood finally what her mother had been trying to tell her all those years, that sometimes the greatest transformations come not from people who have always been good, but from people powerful enough to admit they were wrong and brave enough to become someone new. That sometimes redemption is not about erasing the past, but about spending the present, choosing differently. That sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is to stop running from their own humanity and finally turn to face it. The rain had stopped. Dawn was breaking over the cemetery, and somewhere in the light, if you listened closely enough, You could almost hear the echo of a man finally learning to forgive himself.